All right, we talked about it a little bit in the last lesson, but we are on class 4, lesson 3. We need to talk about heat control before we get into the meat of forging a blade. Heat control with forging a blade is so much more particular than with stock removal of blade. Why can I say that with confidence? It's because you are under the heat much more often when you're forging it. There's a lot of different things involving this. For example, with stock removal, you really only need to heat it up during the normalization and the quench, so the heat treat, of course the temper. With forging it, obviously, it needs to be under the heat much more. So let's talk about some of the core basics about heat control, and then we'll do so practically while we're forging. It has to do with grain structure. If you work your steel at an improper temperature, you can cause so many problems that you won't even know are there until much later. For example, if you overheat your steel, you can start to really damage that grain structure and make it crumbly and brittle. And if you're using a coal forge, you can even burn that steel off. You'll see it on bladesmithing competitions a lot when they lose focus on a coal forge especially, and then their billet or whatever they're working on falls in half or the end falls off because it got overheated and it ended up actually burning, wrecking the steel. Conversely, if you work your steel too cold, you will cause stress fractures all the way through that thing. Once your steel starts to drop temperature and it starts to look like red or cooler, you need to put it back in the forge and not work it cold. Never, ever hammer on cold steel. A cold steel is relative, of course, because, 1,000 degrees sounds like it's really hot. But for forging steel, 1,000 degrees is not hot enough. Now, it is true that there's a lot of differences in the way that steel reacts, the different types of steel reacts to heat. For instance, 1080 steel is more forgiving under the heat, whereas 5160 I have found tends to be a very heat sensitive steel. So you need to take care of it a little bit more. Usually work it on the higher end of the heat scale. You can temper it a little bit higher for various reasons. It has to do with the components that make up that individual alloy. But we don't need to get super specific. We'll be using 1095 steel, which is a great steel for both beginner and advanced smiths. In fact, some of the best blades are still made out of 1095. So we're just going to go nice and simple, straightforward. So now let's talk about heat control for the heat treat. We've already talked a little bit about some of the heat treat procedure for a stock removal blade, but it's even more important for when we are forging a blade. And the reason is that because that steel is under the heat for so long while you're forging it, the grain structure inside that steel starts to expand and become very coarse. If you were to go straight from forging and then just dunk the steel into the oil, you could fracture it. It may actually break where you see a large crack, or it may just be a stress fracture where you don't even see it inside. Watch almost any episode of Forged in Fire and you'll see that it'll break from use and you'll see a dark line. Usually that's because it was quenched too hot or it wasn't normalized properly, and then that grain structure was very, very coarse and open. So therefore it was very brittle and there was a stress fracture in there, possibly from working it too cold, whatever the case is. There's so many different things to watch out for. So a good rule of thumb is to work your steel when it's nice and bright yellow. And when it starts to dip below that, put it back into the forge or pull it out before it gets too much, because when you're working a blade, eventually you start forming the tip of a blade. And if it's a real sharp tip, that tip can overheat before the rest of your blade is up to temperature sometimes. So you need to learn how to work the heat of your forge and how to move it in and out in the forge to prevent that tip from overheating. Maybe that even involves keeping that tip thicker and then grinding it later, whatever works for you. There's a lot of different methods to prevent that from happening. Then, once you're able to normalize it and start shrinking that grain structure, you remember how it does that? You bring it up to critical temperature and then you let it cool slowly. and that slowly starts to shrink that grain structure and work out any of those stress points that may have happened because of the temperatures that you're working while you're forging. And it prepares it for the quench, of course. So we've talked about that, and we will talk about that. But more so than stock removal, heat control is essential. Just a couple quick notes on that, and now we're going to see it in a practical way as we start forging our blade. And we'll begin using it out of 1095 steel. So it's a relatively more forgiving steel than some of the other ones that we have out there, and it's hardened in oil. So it's going to make it pretty simple. It's a really good steel for bladesmithing. Okay, let's go on to the next lesson.